I'd like to welcome everyone. This is our July call of the coffee chat, the PCMI coffee chat. I see some new faces, some old faces that have joined the meeting. Uh, this is I think a particular special meeting where we're gonna have John as our speaker. I'll tell a little bit more about John and the session as we move forward. So yeah, I'm an associate managing director at PCMI. I oversee a lot of our research projects and clients across the Americas. And some of the housekeeping rules we have for the COF session. As you might know, this is a very informal session that was created during the pandemic, and we bring together a lot of the industry specialists to discuss in a very informal way some of the hot topics that we see across the payments industry globally. So, Vale, I think you can move to the next slide. You can move one more, yeah. So just a little bit on the rules we have for the session. We ask you guys to please be mindful of your comments as if you were on an in-person event. And other than that, we encourage you guys to participate and collaborate on that. For this session specifically, we're going to have John Price as our guest speaker today. John is the founding partner of AMI, which is PCMI's holding company, and he's also a founding partner for PCMI. Has a lot of experience across a number of industries and research areas. For this particular topic, we thought it would be very interesting to bring John to the discussion, since he brings a lot of knowledge about the political and economical scenario globally, and would be especially interesting to cross that with the payment landscape and all the discussions we are seeing, across the globe, but very weighted on Trump's policy and recent developments. So I welcome you, John, and I think we're going to have a great discussion and a great, or at least a very unique angle from a payments and political perspective.
Well, thank you, Cesar, and welcome everyone. It's great to be back with this group. I've attended mostly as a listener over the last few years. I think I've spoken once before in front of this group. As Cesar points out, I spent a lot of time addressing audiences across different industries, oftentimes private meetings with companies in their sort of planning phases, whether it's the third or fourth quarter, talking about macroeconomic and political trends and how it impacts our economies in the region as well as our industries. And most of the time, I'm talking about Latin America politics and Latin American economic trends. But given since the election of Donald Trump, he's been such a disruptive leader. U.S. policy changes, anticipation of change has had a material impact on so many different industries. Payments was one industry that was not necessarily an obvious candidate to be impacted by ostensibly a tariff-driven foreign policy changes. But there are enough changes when you stack them all up and you look at them together, the Trump effect as a whole is in fact impacting our industry. So I just wanted to go over some of these things, hopefully demystify some of these issues, and hopefully stimulate a conversation. And I want to reiterate Cesar's call to others to speak up, share your thoughts, complement the conversation with your own point of view, your own examples. And I also want to point out that although as the head of AMI, I am ostensibly an investor in PCMI, I am not a payments expert per se. Cesar has many, many more years focused specifically on payments than myself. So as questions arise, I will lean upon Cesar to help me answer those. And Cesar, as we talked about before beginning today, feel free to interject at any point to what I'm saying with your own point of view, your own experience. So we've identified a half dozen issues where we think the new U.S. administration is changing the landscape and obliging the payments industry to adapt. So let's look at those. The first one is remittances. Was battered around a 10% remittance tax. It was brought down to where it stands today, proposed wise, at 3.5%. It is important to understand that this tax applies to non-US citizens. So part of what makes this a difficult thing to absorb in the remittance industry is not just that there's a tax that needs to be extracted from the flow of money and paid to the government and the administrative costs that come with that, but they need to build into their, particularly the digital platforms that handle remittances increasingly. They need to build into that proof of citizenship. And so not only is that a sort of an additional bureaucratic burden for the remittance sender, but it means that, software changes have to be made to your platform. Privacy permission to, whether it's to take your passport number or your driver's license information and cross-reference that with your own database. There is a vetting process that needs to be built into that transaction. It slows down the transaction. It makes it more burdensome. It's inevitably going to lead to some mistakes being made, and it's additional administrative cost of running your remittance platform. There is also the longer-term impact of what people perceive to be increased deportations. The reality is that the level of deportations in the United States grew most dramatically during the Obama administration, which would seem counterintuitive. A Democratic government, a government that by and large has been far less critical of immigration in the last 20 years than the Republican. But what happened under Obama was, following the terrorist attacks of 2001, up until then, there really was no sharing of data between state level, say, policing authorities and national level. And so what would happen was, if you were, say, illegally living in the United States and you had a driver's license, because back then you could get a driver's license without proving your legal status in the United States, and you got a speeding ticket or something other than a civic ticket, but actually a criminal offense. You were in an accident and you got fingerprinted. All of that data about you remained in that state and was not shared with national authorities. Eventually, because of efforts that sort of interstate efforts that began after 9/11 to share data between municipal, state, and national governments, and of course, with cloud storage of information, this became a lot easier. Then, as a illegal immigrant who ends up being charged with a criminal offense in a state, their identity is then cross-checked with national records, and it would be flagged as somebody who is not legally in the United States. And suddenly, the local policing authorities, say in Los Angeles, would be obliged to turn you over to national authorities, and a deportation review and process would begin. That began under Obama. Deportations grew like sixfold, sevenfold, and suddenly, and since then, the US has maintained a pretty steady level of deportations, limited not by the prosecutorial sort of efforts, but limited by the judicial capacity, and the capacity to hold and review these people and give them, a proper review process. And so in reality, even though Trump has these very high visible raids, the ability of the US judicial machinery to deport more people is limited. What is happening is the dramatic news coverage of these ICE raids in the United States is being shared across Latin America. And so people who were poised to cross the Darien Gap, for instance, in Panama, and make their way north, that's not only a huge investment of time for those people, but it costs money. It costs probably $5,000 a head to go from, say, Panama to the United States by foot, by land, by bus, et cetera, pay the coyotes to cross the border. And so people are saying, well, if I'm going to spend that much money and when I get to the US, I might get deported, no, I'm not going to do that. And so what we're seeing is by their own volition, migrants turning back and going back to their home countries, even facing obviously very dire economic consequences in doing so, and in many cases fearing for their lives. But that is the ripple effect of this very noisy, rhetorical approach by Trump around deportation. Even though the numbers aren't likely to change that much, there's a lot more noise, a lot more scare tactics, and that is having an impact on the number of people. We know from studying remittances, we've done several studies in this space over the years, that when a person comes, and it's usually a young man, comes to the United States as a migrant, as soon as they start getting a job and start making money, they start sending money home. They are essentially living on their own. They have to only tend for themselves. They figure out how to live very inexpensively in the United States, and they're sending home a good chunk of their paycheck, probably 25 to 30% of their paycheck, back to their home country. Over time, they pick up American consumption habits. They pursue, their own ambitions. Maybe they, instead of living in one room with four others, they eventually, divide an apartment with three others. And their own costs in the United States begin to go up. Maybe they find a partner and settle down. And now suddenly they've got a lot more expenses at home in the United States. And their connection to home back home becomes weaker vis-a-vis the obligations they have in the United States. And so naturally, the remittance flows drop off. We see this time and time again. They drop off over the course of 5 years. So if you don't have a continued fresh push of migrants, then the long-term remittance flows are threatened. And that is a slower moving threat to the remittance industry, but one that you need to be aware of.
Right.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Please, yeah.
So talking about 3.5%, but it could be 1%. But regardless, if there is a tax on remittances for non-citizens, therefore the remittance companies are collecting identities and confirming citizenship in order to not add that tax on it. Is that going to be reported, or does it already get reported to the Federal Reserve? Like, this money was sent by this citizen to this destination? Is that something that's new?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer. And I want to point out that Danny Ayala, who is a participating consultant with PCMI, actually corrected me and pointed out that where we stand today, the tax is actually reduced to 1% and only applies to in-person remittances. So that doesn't answer your question, but I open the floor to Danny. If you can answer that question, if those people's identities are being checked, even if it's just the in-person remittances, is that information being reported? Does anybody know? Because I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. the bill went through 3 cycles. The original proposal was actually 5%. Then they dropped it to 3.5%. Then they dropped it to 1%. The good news on the 1% is that, if there's any good news, is that they're excluding digitally originated remittances. So as long as the way of origination is through a bank and/or through a digital fintech provider or a digital means, you are not required to take the tax, and you are not required to validate the identity, because that person would have supposedly been identified by the bank as a legitimate person that has an ID.
Right.
The one knockout element, which could change again, is that they also are not being required to verify the immigration status of the individual, which in the US is quite difficult to do unless you have access to E-Verify, which is a system used by employers, which also is prone to issues. So that's one thing there. The information being sent to the government, there's some infrastructure built, not into the Federal Reserve, Nick, but actually into the people who are, sort of looking at the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism activity. So it's not a well-known fact that both SWIFT as well as the large remittance companies, the big names, they actually have connections through FinCEN, where they're feeding FinCEN all the data of transactions that goes through with limited details, but that information is being fed, and FinCEN analyzes that data across the entire ecosystem to find patterns, primarily to identify concerning activities, networks primarily of money movement going from one individual to multiple, or the opposite. So that's a real activity today. And then on the other hand, banks also have similar connectivity, and they also are required to file two things: cash transaction reports, or CTRs, when there's a transaction that is over $10,000 in cash, or when there is a suspicious type of activity happening in front of the teller that they don't feel comfortable or confident, or if there is a suspicious activity report where the bank deems a transaction, even if it's $300 to be suspicious, they file a SART with FinCEN. If you look up FinCEN, there are millions of SARs filed every year. There's a lot of complaining going on by industry advocates that nobody really knows what happens to the data after it goes to FinCEN, because the enforcements are very limited. Sorry, John, took a little bit.
No, that's great. Fantastic contribution. I really appreciate that. Any other questions? That was a great level of detail. Appreciate that, Danny. Let's move to the second trend, and that is, what has the threat of trade protectionism done to our currencies? It has added a level of volatility to currencies, whether it's the Mexican peso or now the Brazilian real, and just the uncertainty about that. So for money movement, particularly, those who are concerned about contracts in dollars and what does it mean for payment, say 30 days, 60 days hence. As a result, we're seeing more hedging being used, currency hedging, to provide a little bit more assurity to people in terms of future cash flows. We're also seeing the preference for dollar-based or even euro-based or stablecoin denominated payments. So changing of contracts between importers and exporters to take away some of that volatility, take away some of that FX risk that comes with postponed payments based on contracts today. So important for anybody who's handling cross-border payments that they have adequate FX hedging tools, and that they are employing multiple the ability to transact in different currencies. That is definitely a trend that we're seeing, and particularly for fintechs who tend to be able to move more quickly in terms of changing their offering, we're seeing them as sort of first movers on this, adding these features, adding these hedging and multiple currency transaction ability features to their cross-border movement products.
Hey, John, quick question.
Yeah.
I think I have heard from some people saying that Trump is actually in favor of having a weaker dollar across the table, and that perhaps to support U.S. exports and even tourism in the U.S. What's your view on that? Do you think that's a reality, or that's a consequence of some of the initial actions that he had?
He's in favor of having what? What was it?
Like a weaker dollar in comparison to other currencies.
Yeah, generally speaking, he's hell bent on this idea of the deindustrialization of the United States, which is a debatable point, is a direct reaction to an overpriced currency. And he would like to undermine, therefore, the strength of the US dollar by firing Jerome Powell and bringing in somebody who is more liberal with and willing to lower interest rates in spite of continued high inflation. So the US dollar generally has lost, I think, about 7% versus its weighted blend of currencies since he came into office. So there's already been an impact. But it's the uncertainty that these policies on again, off again is adding a degree of currency volatility, even if the long-term impact has been a general a weakening of the US dollar. It's the FX volatility that worries people, and that, if you're a manufacturer and you're selling and you're extending credit over 60 days or 90 days, and your product on its own only delivers a margin of 12, 15%, and you're losing 4 or 5% in FX, that's a huge, you need to hedge that. And the hedging might cost you 1 or 2 points. So this is all a soft and often hidden cost on business. Shall we move to the next one? So we're all aware that the U.S. has labeled a number of organized criminal groups, the majority of them in Mexico, but also in Brazil, and the Venezuelan group as well, which is not really housed in any one country. And by labeling them terrorist organizations, there is a whole playbook of compliance that comes with that and is applied to the banking system. Generally speaking, Mexico is being the focus of concern here, and we saw also how 3 smaller Mexican banks were identified and pursued with investigation. But I think the bigger problem here is the know your customer implications and know your vendor implications for manufacturers who set up shop in Mexico. So if you're a Mitsubishi or a Nissan and you're working with hundreds of vendors in Mexico and you are assembling cars and some of those are being exported to the United States, the next level of enforcement is going to go beyond banks and is going to look at those companies and say, how do we know that you are not buying parts from a company that is laundering money? And this is an AML, these companies are not used to applying a sort of AML restrictions or rules of engagement with their vendors the way that banks do with their customers. So this is an area of concern that has not yet been used as a negotiating tool by the Americans, but has been, my understanding, in conversations, high-level conversations between the White House and Los Pinos in Mexico is that, yes, this is a kind of tacit threat that if the Americans don't see movement by certain assemblers from Mexico into the United States, this is a sort of a tool that an enforcement tool that they could bring to the table. So this is a genuine concern. And again, I think Mexican banks and frankly, most banks across Latin America already went through the painful process of improving their KYC and AML measures over the last 15 years. But there are certainly some smaller banks that are not scrutinizing enough, and there's certainly fintechs who probably are vulnerable to greater enforcement. And then, of course, there's the whole, like I said, the long tail of supply chain where these companies are completely unprepared for this. So this is an area that, as PSPs that are handling U.S.-linked movement of monies, I don't know to what degree the new rules have been established for them, but this is something that they're going to have to adapt to. That there may very well be, much like the Colombians went through for years, Mexicans and possibly Brazilian financial players will have to step up their AML processes. And this is particularly worrisome for fintechs, that one of the things that banks complain about is that they haven't been subject to the same level of AML compliance as that banks are. And so this is an area that I open the floor to those of you who work in that space and deal with this issue to hear your points of view, but it's certainly something that we flagged as a potential problem in the next year or so. Any thoughts by any of you?
If I can add to that, John,
Sure.
I think you're spot on. Probably two key points. One, something that happened back in March that aligns to what you're saying. And back in March, the federal government issued a rule through FinCEN where they identified about 30 zip codes in the California and Texas border. And any money service business operating in those zip codes were required to report any cash transaction reports over $200, not $10,000, which is the standard, to the federal government. And it's sort of a test. It was set up for 179 days. I understand they have eliminated some of the zip codes required, but they're basically any transaction that you do at a counter, you're being asked to provide all your information so that the federal government has it. And it's specifically targeting the cartel, money laundering activity that happens in the border. If you ever go to El Paso or San Diego, you typically will see a lot of, sort of exchange houses and remittance houses right on the border. You're kind of wondering, why are people sending money right on the border if they can just walk it over, right? There's always been a question around that. So that's one activity. A huge burden on the MSPs that do that. The second thing is, when I'm observing in my engagements, consulting with fintechs and banks, primarily in the cross-border space, is we're seeing more banks shying away from wanting to partner with fintechs that are heavy on cross-border. And we're also seeing go to stronger requirements by banks. So there continues to be a tightening of options to offer in terms of banks. And certain banks are basically saying no more cross-border for now until we see what happens when the dust settles. So there's still a bit of a fear factor created, which historically has been there, but now it seems to be increased.
No, great point of view. This is, we've seen this around the world. Americans finding it tricky to get banked in foreign banks for similar reasons, and now we're seeing that lowering of the threshold from 10,000 to 200. That's a huge development. Will be interesting to see if that is in fact just a pilot project or if it gets expanded. Any other contributing thoughts? Any other questions from those of you on the call? Go ahead and speak up, because I can only see so many of you here. Okay, let's move forward to the next one, and that is the shift, greater enforcement, of course, of traditional money movement channels. One of the things that it does is creates demand for less formal or even crypto-based channels. We've seen this happen in remittances. When remittances were heavily policed into Cuba, living here in Miami, there was a peer-to-peer, very sophisticated peer-to-peer network that would be set up where people would get on a plane with $9,900, and those monies were given to them by 50 different people, and they would go and deliver them door to door in Havana to recipients. So there is the possibility that we will see. I think that the final remittance regulations were pared down to a degree that we won't see a lot of this. But we will see, I think, more and more crypto-enabled remittances, particularly if some of what you talked about, Danny, and some of what was speculated in the question, if there's greater scrutiny of the nationality of people and people want to avoid that kind of detection. What we are seeing is that fintech players are onboarding more and more stable coins, prepaid crypto wallets. And again, to what degree that is a instrument to get around currency controls in certain countries versus avoiding detection by US authorities versus just the popularity of this instrument amongst younger financial customers, or provides actual currency stabilization and therefore saves on FX costs and saves on FX risk or lowers FX risk. There's a lot of reasons why driving it, but what we are seeing is that fintech is onboarding more and more stable coins, particular because they are tied to usually a fiat currency. Again, question to all of you, is this something that you are seeing in your own orbits? This is certainly what we've picked up from talking to people and from working in this industry.
Yeah, Joe, just my take on that. And I honestly, I go back and forth from that as like a lot of the times during the same week. As we see crypto and especially stablecoin as a way to move money, it makes a lot of sense for a lot of the players, and especially when we look across the global south, right? The emerging economies and the more restricted currencies, it makes a lot of sense to transact using the stablecoins. But at the same time, when we compare that with everything that the financial industry has come with the regulation and the AML and the compliance and all those things within the last 20, 30 years, it's going to be really hard to come to terms with crypto as like bypassing the whole thing, right? And I think by the time the governments realize that if there's any potential of not being able to trace properly a transaction, they're going to shut that down very quickly. So I think that's the first take, right? But then at the same time, we have people saying that, this is like Uber or Spotify, right? That's something that the industry never thought was possible, and it happened, right? So like Spotify, no one thought that Spotify could fight the giant media companies, right? And they did. So I think there are good arguments on both sides, but especially regarding AML and compliance and crimes, I think it gets more sensitive. So I honestly don't know if it's going to be, if governments will be more control within that space or not.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that regulators have just been slow to understand and properly regulate crypto. and it just takes its time to work its way through the system. In the meantime, people see it as a way of avoiding certain regulations, but the time on that functionality is probably limited, and eventually regulators will catch up. I think that there's other advantages that come with the speed at which transactions can be realized and the lower costs. But are they enough to compel companies to make the switch? It remains to be seen. Any other thoughts on the adoption of stablecoin and other cryptos into cross-border payment apps and fintech products? No?
I would add that, well, traditional crypto, Bitcoin and all the others, have been primarily a speculation tool, right? And clearly they seem to be going mainstream with institutional funds using them. I don't think they hold much promise for traditional remittances because of the volatility of the value,
Right,
and the large amount of scams that have happened in the past and that will happen in the future. However, stablecoin technology, it's really all the rage right now as a back-end tool to bypass the correspondent banking rules and deal with the scarcity of banks and the unwillingness of banks to facilitate activities. And while that's good in the US, we're still seeing countries in Latin America and Asia, in Latin America really lagging, because in Asia, they're actually very much active in stablecoins. So I think we'll see eventually a consumer-facing play, but right now, most of it is on the back end, whether it's a Bitso or a Circle or one of the large players. If anyone's close to seeing success is PayPal with their own stablecoin, and that's good and bad, because what we're also seeing is every bank and every fintech is coming up with its own stablecoin, which sort of like not very productive unless you have or own a huge ecosystem. Because then you have a convertibility issue, and there's a cost to convert from one to the other, I'm sure. So Chase announced originally they were create their own stablecoin. Yesterday, Citi said they're thinking about their own stablecoin as well. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We should probably stick to the 2 or 3 standards that are out there, USDT and USDC. But we'll see what happens. It's still too early to tell.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that by anchoring it to the dollar, it takes away that volatility risk, which makes more sense for certainly remittances and smaller. I think that the more dramatic cases like Venezuela and before currency controls were lifted in Argentina, people were willing to stomach that volatility risk just because they needed to get money out. But you're absolutely right, I think. And this notion of, everybody, it's like everybody printing their own version of a dollar. It's a bit silly. But hopefully there'll be some rationalization in time.
Yeah, and I must add that today is kind of a big day, because supposedly today they're going to put the bill to the Senate for a 3rd time to get it approved on crypto. It hasn't passed. It was expected to pass last Friday, didn't make it, then Monday, and today our president said that he expects it to pass today. So we'll see.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Let me jump over there. Sorry, Jerry.
Please.
Here.
Jerry, go ahead.
I think that part of the point of view, the stable coin is going to be like the wallet for the big bank. It's going to use it as an electronic wallet to pick the money, because they can use it as a cheaper money for investment point of view. All the banks, like Pfizer, all the people are going to try to create the e-wallet solution, because the stable coin in that situation will be most of the digital wallet for the banking to keep it inside real money and make the money transfer. That's going to be giving a lot of leverage to make the investment, capital market, and different positions in the market. It's the same happened with the Starbucks, the same business they happen with a different digital wallet they're using for local business, it's going to be a local ecosystem. I think it's going to happen for some time, few years, until the definition of what's going to be the real players in the market, like the different Paxos or the other guys are going to be per. But that's going to happen for a couple of years, at least 4 years, from my point of view. And then the market is going to start more definition about what going to be the real fiat currencies is going to be in the market. It's going to be the euros, it's going to be the dollar. In the market is going to start definition based on the real policies. That's going to be a part of the process. That's my perception on the point. But of course, that's going to be happening inside America, and then the rest of the world is going to be aligned with this situation. That's my perception.
Interesting. That makes sense to me. Cesar, Danny, any thoughts on that, on what Jerry just shared?
Yeah, I like the comparison with Starbucks in a very different type of comparison, but I agree. I think it's gonna be some time until the market normalize the understanding of the of the process and normalizing how it's going to work. I think it's important to highlight that a stable coin, it's actually, when we're talking about a stable coin, if we have a company or an individual, you're buying and selling an asset, right? It's different than you exchange the currency, right? It's different than FX, right? FX, you're actually selling a currency and buying another one. When you do that through a stable coin, you're actually buying an asset and then selling the asset, right? And then so liquidity, risk, there's a lot more involved in the process. But I think we're gonna learn a lot more about it within the next year or two.
Yeah, if you zoom into that to add the process, if you prefer to have the money in Starbucks, in Citibank, JP Morgan, or PayPal, that's going to be the question, the guys. And then they're going to try to take off the money for PayPal, for a bank in any way, to the digital bank for Citibank or JP Morgan in order to move the money in this ecosystem. It's try to take the same case as Cell. You think about Cell as the point of view to move the money inside US versus to have PIX as a global solution for the market. They try to create a digital wallet for the currencies inside the American market to avoid go to the competition with the third parties, something like that. That's my perception, Klaus, of course. Personal perception.
No, I agree with you on that. There is another element under the covers here, which is when you look at the fine print in the Genius Act, which is the legislation that deals with stable coins, and you look at the fine print on the Chase announcement on their own stable coins, these funds are going to be sort of bankable by the entity sitting on the funds. So someone like Chase now is sitting on potentially over time billions of dollars, where it's almost like you're issuing your own US dollar equivalent currency, and you can bank that real currency in other securities and earn a return on those above and beyond what you would be able to do with traditional deposits. Look at the fine print in the Genius Bill. It actually opens up a huge opportunity for banks to make even more money. There's some risk associated with that, I think, ultimately, but the risk concerns in DC are shifting in a different direction these days, right?
Yeah, it used to add it. That's including the person or company, they have the digital wallets, private digital wallet for staying coin. They can use the same money to make investment for everyone. That gives you a large opportunity to Binance or Edibar being created with this company, Coinbase, anyone they can use the money, not for a trust account, for investment point of view. Very interesting.
Yeah, that certainly changes the balance sheet dynamics of any bank. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. I think we got one more sort of trend to discuss, and that's obviously there's a lot of discussion around the U.S. policy changes, not just the tariff numbers, but also the language being used, the aggressive language being used, not just with traditional adversaries of the United States, but also with traditional allies when it comes to trade. And how are they reacting? And one of the things that we're seeing is that certainly trade flows are changing. So U.S. trade numbers in the first 6 months of the year are down, both exports and imports. Trade volumes for China are actually up. So they've obviously lost a lot of export volumes to the United States, but overall they've more than picked up the slack by selling elsewhere. The same happens for Canada. The same has happened for Europe. So there is a decline in the trade volume between U.S. and its partners. Some of that is exaggerated by the uptick in purchase of inventory by many U.S. importers ahead of Liberation Day, precisely because they wanted to hold that inventory at the lower, at the non-tariff taxed price levels. And so it will still take time to see what are the long-term impacts on U.S. trade, but certainly there's a genuine threat that U.S. trade levels will go down. And of course, that is going to hurt some of the demand for cross-border payments. It also means that countries are not necessarily going to be trading in dollars. The dollar is still the predominant trading currency around the world, but increasingly trade with Europe is denominated in euros. Trade with China is denominated in renminbi. And so there is a need more and more for those PSPs who handle cross-border to take on other currencies, not just US dollar and local currency. Again, this goes back to the point made earlier where the instability, the off again and on again, means that you've got greater FX currency volatility, and therefore the ability to build in hedging products becomes an important solution addition to any cross-border PSP. And for a lot of for a lot of fintechs, this is a new product feature that they're adding to their functionality. So again, we talked about, Danny talked about some banks just wanting to stay away from cross-border. So access to trade financing will be maybe reduced in terms of the total number of banks in the United States willing to take that on. It's already a number that's far less than the total number of banks, but that number may shrink, and that means higher trade finance costs. So this is a less direct correlation trend, but we're taking into account lower trade volumes, the need for other currencies, and the need for hedging as responses to these market trends. And on the next slide, I believe we have a summary of what this means for payment. So on the left, you've got the trends we've just walked through. Call it a minor remittance tax, but also migration enforcement, a lot of noise, resulting in higher costs, lower volumes, and users seeking cheaper and possibly informal channels. You've got tariffs and inflation leading to greater currency fluctuation, which means greater need for hedging in your multi-currency wallets. U.S. compliance actions, heightened AML burden on PSPs, some of them dropping out of the business, as Danny pointed out, more costly onboarding, slower flows. Informal crypto shift, rise in P2P stablecoin remittances, and potentially greater regulatory and fraud risks for those involved. And just trade instability, putting pressure on volumes and putting pressure on the need for payment systems to incorporate other currencies and provide hedging tools. So that kind of is, in a nutshell, a summary of what we talked about. I think if there's any other slides, we can maybe remove the slides and have us all as talking heads here. If you could take care of that, Valentina. Oh, sorry. Good point. One more thing. What does this mean for PSPs and fintechs? Again, it's up to you, obviously, to gauge the level of readiness you already have in place of your business models for these changes, whether it's worth making the investment to make these changes. But certainly offering more multi-currency wallets and hedging capabilities is something that's going to be, I think, an interesting differentiator. Integrating crypto, particularly stablecoin rails, and greater compliance safeguards, both necessary to remain in business and also a potential up on your competitors at the banks. Building enhanced AML, KYC compliance solutions. Again, I think this is a enforcement instrument that the US thus far has been relatively light and targeted. There's no question that they are using this instrument in particularly to twist the arms of the Mexican government. I was in Mexico City and had a very interesting chat with a consultant there who works very closely with the Sheinbaum administration. And if you recall, in the last G7 summit that took place in Canada, President Trump left a day early to go back to Washington to oversee what happened a couple of days later, which was the US airstrikes in Iran. And one of the most important meetings that he missed was the sit down with Sheinbaum, which was scheduled to be a couple of hours. And when the Sheinbaum administration sort of voiced their protestations to Trump's chief of staff, she turned around and said, well, of the 10 things we asked you to work on, you haven't done squat. And some of those 10 things had nothing to do with the trade. They had to do with what the US Treasury, intelligence agencies perceive as too much of a penetration by organized criminal influence in the actual cabinet of the Sheinbaum administration, as well as certain key leadership positions within the greater apparatus of government. And where I'm going with this is to say that what we are hearing in terms of the public pronouncements by both, which seems to be a relatively harmonious discussion between the two governments, is far from it. The Americans are not happy with the pace of change in Mexico, and their demands go way beyond international cross-border bilateral issues. And the Americans are imposing their will on the inner domestic government leadership selection in Mexico, specifically with an eye on organized crime. And so one of the instruments that I believe that they will ratchet up on if the Mexicans don't do their bidding is around compliance of AML. They could really do damage to the Mexican economy and its export economy with greater enforcement that goes well beyond banks into the long tail supply chains in Mexico. Organized crime rackets are already involved in much of the production of foodstuffs. So if you are a food processor who is selling products into the United States, you are probably sourcing from a agricultural producer that has some organized criminal money, if not operational personnel behind it. So this level of compliance could go a lot higher, and that's a real wild card. Monitoring policy updates and adjusting pricing exchange models dynamically. So that's a tough one because, as we've seen, US policy announcements, when they're made versus when they're legislated, can be a huge distance one from the other. I think the example that Danny provided around, or that he provided more information on around remittances, we went from originally a 10% voice proposal to a 5% solid proposal to a 1% reality. So rather than monitoring what Trump is twittering, it's about monitoring actual regulatory changes. And then partnering with local operators to tap informal corridors while mitigating risks. That is a trickier action item to take on. But if in fact we are seeing a rise in informal movement of monies and there's an effort to somehow capture that business, that is certainly something that some in the business will pursue. So with that, I think that's the end of it in terms of what we wanted to portray. We can move on from this. Our next session will be August 20th, and let me turn it back to you, Cesar, if you want to close off. And
thank you very much, John. I think that was a very interesting discussion. Definitely a new angle from a PCMI perspective. The political and payments conjunction was a very interesting topic and discussion. So thank you everyone for joining the session. You're going to receive this presentation and also the recording over the registered email, over your registered email. And I see you guys on August 20th. Thank you. Thank you.
If I could just thank you, Cesar. If I could just add, we'll also be producing a sort of summary article of some of this, so that will be useful for you to share with colleagues. And I just want to give a special shout out to Danny for your contributing thoughts. Danny, that was really, really helpful. And to Jerry for sharing with us your point of view. You know, when we chose the coffee chat title for a reason, that is to really foster a conversation. We don't want to be perceived as the Moses on the hill, telling you how to think. We really want to stimulate conversation. So anyone who steps forward and gives their point of view is always welcome in this forum, and we really appreciate when you do.
Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice rest of the week.